So, hello guys. I wasn't going to record a video lecture for this chapter, but luckily for you guys, Olympic curling is on, and you don't really need to listen to the commentary to understand what's happening. I don't know why, but I have a intense fascination with Olympic curling. I could watch this for hours. It is by far the greatest Olympic sport of all time. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking badminton, and you're not wrong. Badminton is pretty fun, but Olympic curling is where it's all about. And with that in mind, we're going to discuss. This is not a difficult chapter by any means. The only hard part about this chapter is where the 1920s didn't have a lot of concrete details for you guys to remember. There weren't a lot of people, places, and things to remember as much as here is a cultural shift that's going down. The thing about this chapter is that there are lots of concrete details that are really easy to get confused. There are a lot of programs. It's called alphabet soup. You're going to have a million acronyms in here. Now, again, there are hundreds of acronyms and programs we could be discussing. I'm going to choose a couple that I think are the most important, but there are lots of them. So, good luck. There's no easy way to remember them. There just isn't. It's going to take a little bit of memorization on your guys' part. There's just kind of the way how it works. Not much I can do about that. But fortunately, I'm only going to give you about five out of the potential thousands I could give you. With that in mind, let's talk about the most depressing time in America. And no, I'm not talking about the time that dude lost on American Idol when the other dude should have won, or whatever. I'm talking about something much more important. An economic collapse, perhaps the greatest of all time, until the one that you lived through. But either way. So unfortunately, you can't understand the Great Depression without a intrinsic understanding of how the US economy works. Let me see if I can give you guys a brief overview. And I'm also going to call back to some things in history that we've talked about. So if you are viewing this and you are not in my class, well, good luck. So, here is how this whole thing goes down. It's important to note that really about every 20 years in US history, we've had a panic. Starting back in, 1807, 1837, there's one during the Civil War, there's one in 1873, there's one in 1893. We tend to have a panic about every 20 years. In fact, some economists argue that that is a normal part of the US economy. The US economy is going to have a downturn, and in that downturn, there's going to be some spending cuts and blah, blah, blah. And eventually, America almost always finds its way out of these economic panics and builds itself back up. This is seen as a normal part of the economy. Now, a lot of people would argue that it's a really crappy part of the economy, and it's part of the reason why things always tend to go so bad in America, but it is a normal part of our economy. In fact, you guys lived through one. It happened in about 2008, and we're just crawling out of it now. So, buy a house this week if you can, because in about 5 years, you won't be able to afford one. Good times. Okay, anyway, the 1920s are a period of great economic prosperity in the United States, but a lot of that prosperity is built on a false foundation. Here's what that means. Many companies practice something that I like to call supply side economics. The idea here is that if a company builds as many of a product as possible, someone's going to buy it. That means the product will tend to be cheaper, as you can see on this supply and demand graph over here on the bottom left, which I could explain to you, but it's hard to do on a PowerPoint like this, so hopefully you got it in class. Anyway, companies are making a lot of product, which means their products are cheaper, but the problem is there's also a lot of product. This leads companies to build more and more of a product even if people stop buying it, because eventually it's going to come to a point when demand is just simply going to disappear. The only way for a company to make back money then was to lay off workers or stop production. Now, this is actually going to make things worse because if people don't have jobs, they can't buy your product. So it's a bad problem all the way around. Now, remember farmers? We talked about why farmers really exploded during World War One because Europe is desperate for food. So farmers are going to be moving out to the Great Plains. They're going to be attempting to make foods at a World War One level, but unfortunately, the world does not need that much food being produced. Now, again, if you have a lot of a supply of something, the price has to go down. That's just how the magic of economics works. So, farmers are making a lot of food, and the prices for them are simply going down. On top of that, there's going to be some new agricultural innovations. So, farmers are going to be purchasing really expensive equipment with really bad loans, and they're going to be unable to pay them off. Ironically, these new machines also meant that these farmers could produce even more, which is going to make the problem even worse. But let's put a little pause on farmers. We'll come back to them in a little bit. Banks are also going to engage in risky loans during this time period. Just like before, any money held in a bank is not insured by the US government, so if a bank let out your money, you would never get it back. And if a bank closed or collapsed, you would lose all of your money. That's what America looked like up until this horrible event. 1928 and 1929 are going to see a huge upswing in the market. Ironically, the Great Depression starts with perhaps the greatest moment of economic prosperity in the United States. How? Well, average people like you and me, started putting their money into the stock market. And what starts to happen is that stocks become super inflated in value. Here's how this would work. Millions of Americans wanted to play the stock market because the market was going up and seemed like an easy way to get money. So many people started to buy stocks on margin. This means that they would purchase a stock for 25% of the stock's value, and then they were lent the remaining 75% by stockbrokers. As that stock made money, the individual, i.e., you, would be able to pay back the remaining 75% to the stockbroker. And again, as long as the economy and the market is always going up, this is a great idea. You are still getting a piece of paper that gives you ownership in a company, but you're not having to pay the entire amount up front. This is a great idea so long as the economy does well. But what happens if you buy a piece of paper for the piece of paper is worth $100, but you only spend $25 on it? You owe a stockbroker $75. What happens if that piece of paper never gains more value? Or even worse, what happens if that piece of paper starts to lose value? You still owe $75, but now that piece of paper is only worth 50 or 40 or maybe one day 10. The piece of paper that was originally valued at $100, you paid 25, but now it's only worth 10. You still owe $75 on a $10 piece of paper. Again, this is kind of a complicated concept, but this is part of the reason why the stock market fails. The prices of stocks are artificially inflated. There is not as much money in the market as people are saying there is, and it's going to lead to a lot of problems when one day the bills are going to come in for all of these stocks. In September of 1929, the prices of the stock market reached an all-time high. In fact, I'm not sure on the math, but we've never really had as high of stock prices, even today, as we did back then. The numbers are different, there's many more businesses, blah, 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 but still, just pretend with me here that the market is at its greatest, highest peak during this time period. Now, if you've never played the stock market, there's one rule. When the market is going up, and it's a good thing to do to try to time it just right. As the market reaches its peak, you want to sell your stocks for the most amount of money. In September of 1929, the market was kind of skyrocketing straight up, and many investors said, okay, now it's time for us to bail. We can make a lot of money now. Our stock price has gone up, the piece of paper is worth a lot of money. Let's get the cash right now. So there's a huge sell-off in September of 1929. So people are going to try to sell their stocks to make money. Well, that's okay if only a couple people do that, but suddenly hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are going to start selling their pieces of paper to try to recoup their money. And then, on October 29th, 1929, the stock market officially crashes. This event is known as Black Tuesday. Investors sold their stocks at pennies on the dollar. So what starts to happen here is when you sell a stock, technically the value of that stock goes down a little bit. So for example, if a stock right now is listed at $150 and you want to sell your share in it, somebody might say, I'll give you $149. Well, that means that for everyone else, that stock is only worth $149. And then it goes down and down and down. So this, again, happens on a small scale today on a daily basis. But if hundreds of thousands of people are doing this, suddenly As the supply of that stock goes up, as our graph showed us previously, the demand is going to go down, and when the demand goes down, the price also goes down. Again, I could show you on an animated graph, but I can't do that visually, so good luck. Anyway, investors are going to start selling their stocks for pennies on the dollar. What ends up happening is that a $100 piece of paper is going to all of a sudden be $90, then 80, then 10, then 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then like 50 cents. People are just desperate to get rid of these stocks because the market starts to crash and go downwards. Again, in September, it's at the highest point it has ever been. As people start selling their stocks, the market starts to go down and down and down and down and down. In October 29th, it kind of hit a head and everything just fell. In fact, over the next 3 years, the market is going to lose a significant chunk of its value. 89% of its value disappears by 1932. On Black Tuesday alone, over $15 billion is going to be lost. Really, what is going to happen to the American economy is not going to be fixed until World War II. Many historians argue that the Great Depression is only solved by the United States entering World War II. And had we not have entered World War II, we never would have gotten out of the Great Depression. It's kind of scary. The gross national product of the United States, again, we are the most prosperous country in the world at this time period, is going to be cut in half, and over 90,000 businesses are going to be forced to close. Not a good time at all. To make matters worse, the government's response is going to accelerate this problem. Remember, we have a president. Our president is Herbert Hoover. He has this idea of rugged individualism, which says that America should just pretty much take care of itself. Well, he's not going to be a good president to have in office during a huge economic decline. In order to protect American farmers, Hoover is going to pass something called the Haley-Smoot Tariff, or Haley-Joel Osmond, some sort of tariff. He's going to pass this tariff. The idea here is we can protect American businesses if we increase the tariff by like 50%. But you guys know what happens if America increases its tariffs, right? Well, if we're going to make Europe, it's going to cost more money for Europe to trade here. Europe's going to increase their tariff with us. So that's exactly what Europe does. If we raise our tariff, Europe raises theirs. And what ends up happening is that the United States and Europe basically just stop trading with each other. Potentially, this great economic collapse could have been avoided if Europe and the United States would play with each other. But the United States isn't really playing with Europe, and Europe is not really playing well with us either. It doesn't help that Europe is still completely economically devastated, but that's another story. Actually, wait, no. It's part of this story. Europe is still economically devastated in the 1920s. They're not in a position to bail us out of this. We hope that they could, but they're not. Because, we've been ignoring them for 10 years. Oops. Either way, Hoover is going to believe that this economic collapse in the United States is actually the fault of Europe, hence why he increased the tariff, or that this should be solved by businesses and locals themselves. In fact, he really doesn't want to spend any federal money to fix this problem because he believes that the U.S. government should stay out of business affairs and that this is a business affair. As time drags on, though, Hoover's eventually forced to do something. Hoover eventually creates something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. The idea here is the RFC is going to make loans to banks and other financial institutions. That way they have more money and don't close. We don't want the banks to close because then all the money's really gone. Not a good time. Unfortunately, this actually doesn't really work, and it's going to basically help out the rich people keep their money, but doesn't help the average American keep their money. This is seen as a huge disaster on the part of Herbert Hoover, and a huge disaster on the part of the United States. Perhaps, perhaps more than any other event in the United States, this economic depression is going to have a huge social change in the United States. It's going to have a huge social change because this Great Depression is going to affect almost every single American, and it's going to affect every single level of society. Men, women, children are going to be affected. The rich are going to be affected. The poor are going to be affected. Immigrants are going to be affected. everyone in America is affected in some way by this Great Depression. Many of the events we've discussed in this class haven't really affected every single American, but this one is going to be felt by every single American, rich or poor, immigrant, whatever. It does not matter. Every single American is going to feel this, and it's going to be seen in every level of American society. It is important to note that the mindset of this time period is not to expect a government bailout. Part of the reason why Hoover's rugged individualism is so powerful is that it's an idea that many Americans share. They don't look to the government for help in this kind of a problem. So many Americans are going to take the burden of this economic collapse and put it on themselves, not put it on the government because the government and big businesses created this problem. They're going to put the blame on themselves. In fact, many historians argue that Americans were not accustomed to dealing with failure, and that's going to make this problem even worse because the American people don't really know what to do. Seems strange, but it's true. Many places started to open called soup kitchens. These soup kitchens were basically exactly what they sound like. They were places for people to go and get food. Now, this food is a marginal term here. Basically, it would be like a gallon of water with one bouillon cube in it, and maybe a couple of, I don't know, apples or something. It's not like you're getting a lot of food here. It's basically just enough to keep humans alive. These are going to be opened by certain people and certain charity organizations, and many Americans are going to find themselves in these soup kitchen lines, waiting for hours just to have basically warm water. That's all the soup's going to become. It's going to be seen as a pretty rough time period in American history. Over a quarter of all Americans are going to need some form of government assistance over the length of the Great Depression. So we'll talk about what that government assistance is, but again, I'm trying to show you that this is going to affect all levels of society. Unemployment is going to be upwards of 30% of Americans out of their jobs, and really, unemployment is going to be bad in this country until World War II. World War II is the only thing that really gets America back to work. And by the way, from the moment we're talking about right now, that's about 12 years away. 25% of white males, I should say, and 50% of black males are going to lose their jobs during the 1930s. And only 25% of women were employed during the 1930s. So again, this is going to be a period where people aren't going to have jobs. In fact, women are going to face the harshest conditions out of everyone. Women are criticized for women working, I should say, are criticized for taking jobs away from men. The thought was that men should be providers for the family, and if a woman is in the workforce, that they're basically just taking a job away from a man. Many married women are fired from their jobs in order to preserve jobs for men. So no matter how much money your family needed, it was always more important to have a man employed than a woman. Many men left their families in shame, so they couldn't handle the fact that they couldn't provide for them, so they just left. Many women are going to be forced to take care of the children on their own in a society that's not really comfortable hiring women right now. The birth rate plummets during this time period. Population growth essentially stops in America and actually starts to go into decline. So our population growth is going to be adversely affected by this economic collapse. On top of that, the suicide rate is going to increase over 30% during this time period, and 3 times as many people were admitted to mental hospitals. This is a crazy time period. Now, what about you guys? What about teenagers? Well, there's one of 2 paths teenagers could take. One was stay in high school because you had nowhere else to go during the day because you couldn't get a job. Or 2 was basically just to leave your family to make them be completely isolated. That way they'd have one less mouth to feed. Speaking of soup kitchens, this is a group of Americans waiting in line for a soup kitchen to get some food. This is perhaps one of the most famous pictures of the era. I like the juxtaposition of the world's highest standard of living with people standing in a bread line. You'll also notice that all of these people in this bread line are black. Now, the reason for this is actually going to be that an American employer is more likely to hire a white man during this time period than to hire anyone else, including women, including immigrants, and including blacks. So women have to deal with this era pretty harshly, but black and immigrant Americans are going to have it even worse than women. Now, by 1932, things have gotten really bad in this country. Really bad in this country. What starts to happen here is that Americans are going to start protesting the government and protesting the president. They set up these camps called Hoovervilles. Now, what had happened here is that many Americans had lost their houses and they had nowhere else to go. So, what they start to do is they start to basically settle in these Hoovervilles, and they take basically pieces of cardboard, whatever trash they can find, and make a city out of it. In fact, the most famous Hooverville is actually going to be put on the White House lawn, I should say. It's basically a shantytown. Now, what ends up happening here is that you have this shantytown built in front of the White House, and then there's going to be a pretty rough event that goes down. It's called the Bonus Army. Here's the story. In 1932, a group of World War I veterans assembled outside the White House to demand their benefits. So the government had set aside some money for World War I veterans to give them when those veterans had reached like retirement age. So I don't know, maybe 30 years later in 1945. So the government had already set aside some money. They basically have a bucket, they put a bunch of money in it and said, as a reward to all the World War I veterans, we're going to give you this money when you're like, I don't know, 50, and then that'll be your reward and your thank you for fighting and serving America during World War I. Now, they weren't supposed to get this money until about 1945. But after a couple years of this Great Depression, many of these soldiers said, hey, look, this money is just sitting in a bucket. We are starving and dying here. Why don't you just give us this money now? That way we can feed our families and maybe help jumpstart the American economy. Sounds like a pretty smart idea, right? The government refused. So the Bonus Army is going to join in these Hoovervilles and basically have a protest in front of the White House. And then President Hoover does perhaps his most unpopular act. Hoover's going to demand that the Bonus Army leave, but they have nowhere to go, so they stay. The protesters of the Bonus Army are basically going to remain on the White House lawn, and they're going to remain in front of the White House even though they've been asked to leave. Eventually, fights start to break out between the protesters and the local police, and Hoover is eventually going to send in the U.S. Army to force the protesters to leave. The U.S. Army is going to fire tear gas and use tanks to intimidate the veterans, and then they burn down the Hooverville and burn down the encampment. I want you guys to think about this mental image. The former soldiers are protesting the U.S. government to get money that is rightfully theirs and has been promised to them already. The government says no and says if you don't leave, we are going to take the U.S. Army and we're going to fire tear gas on you and basically watch you die in front of the White House. Can you imagine if that happened today? What the American response would be? There's a reason why I say that Hoover is a crappy president, and that Hoover, much like the Hoover vacuum, sucks. And now you guys kind of know where that comes from. The American public is horrified at Hoover's actions, and they officially turn on him. Hoover stood absolutely no chance in the next election. But we really need someone to come and save us. But there's a little bit more to the story until our hero arrives. Let's go back and talk about those farmers. So again, farmers are going to have to take out increasingly difficult loans to pay for new equipment. Farmers are farming at an increased rate during this time period, and the machines are actually making this problem worse because they can make farmers farm more easily. So farmers start to move out to get bigger tracts of land to hopefully make some semblance of a profit. It's kind of illogical that if there is too much of a supply of an item, the response of the farming community is going to be to make more of that item. I'm assuming the logic means that if they keep making it, that Americans will buy it, and if Americans buy it, they'll eventually make back money. But it's kind of a rough go. Anyway, the Great Plains had basically started to open up and be developed for farming during this time period. Now, unfortunately, the Great Plains is not really ideally situated for farming, at least not mass scale, because if you know anything about the Great Plains, you would know that it doesn't rain there all that often. Unfortunately, in the 1920s, we had a false sense of security about the Great Plains. They're going to go through a really odd period of rain during this time period, so people thought, okay, maybe we can farm in the Great Plains. But historically, the Great Plains is an area of pretty heavy drought and very little rain. Anyway, we start basically cutting up all of the grass in the Great Plains and setting this land aside for um, growing crops. So we cut up all the grass. And for a couple of years, there's no problem. We cut out the grass, we started planting corn, and it's raining a lot, and corn is growing, and people are eating it, and it's great. Then by the end of the 1920s, unfortunately, right as the Great Depression hits, um, a severe drought is going to hit the Great Plains and basically kill all of those crops. The topsoil is going to turn because of all the dryness is going to turn into a fine powdery dust that's going to blow away as the high winds come through the region. Ironically, had the farmers not have cut down all those grasses to build these farms, those grasses would have held all that dust in. That's kind of what grass does. But all that's been kicked up to plant crops. The crops are all dead because of the drought, and now there's just dust everywhere. Winds pick up on the Great Plains, as tends to happen. That's why they have tornadoes, and they kick up all of that dust. In 1934, the dust clouds were so large that they blacked out the sky in most parts of the United States. Yeah, this is pretty scary. Can you imagine a huge giant storm cloud coming and just basically blanketing the entire city? Los Angeles is going to be covered in upwards, I think, of an inch of dust at certain points. And again, that dust has to travel pretty far. That dust is traveling 1,500 miles and over the Rocky Mountains. That's how crazy this problem really was. Well, the farmers can't stay there. They're going to not be able to make any products, so of course their farms are going to close, and the farmers are going to leave. Now, many of these people come from the Great Plains, which is essentially around the state of Oklahoma, and they're going to start moving their way westward because they hear that there's some opportunities out in California. About 3.5 million of these farmers, we'll call them Okies because that's just a funny name, and that's the name they were given, are going to head towards California. Many people thought that California had a lot of economic opportunities and a lot of jobs available. There really weren't that many here. California did not need 3.5 million farmers. Again, California is still relatively depopulated. Unfortunately, these Okies are going to come to California and have no real opportunities. If you have read the book or seen the movie, The Grapes of Wrath, that is what this story is about. As sad and as tragic as that is exactly what this time period is like. And again, it's just another problem that needs to be solved. So we have a lot going on right now. We have the farmers losing their farms. We have American businesses shutting down. We have Americans who've improperly invested money in the stock market now losing all of their money. We have banks closing, so there's no actual cash anywhere. And on top of all of that, we have a government that doesn't think it's up to them to actually solve these problems. Oh boy, this is going to be the setup for a pretty big change in America. In fact, let's discuss the huge change America goes through. The United States of 1928 and the government of 1928 is drastically different than the government of today. But the thing is, the change that makes the government more like it is right now is coming on the next slide. Let's wait for it. 3, 2, 1. And now it's time to discuss perhaps our most popular and perhaps even our most important U.S. president. Now look, I've discussed this many times. I think Lincoln gets a lot more credit than he really deserves because Lincoln had a lot of personality issues and he was ambivalent on the entire slavery issue. I'm not afraid to make that statement. Now, I'm not going to say that FDR is perfect. In fact, he does a lot of stuff that perhaps the president should not really be doing, and his interpretation of the Constitution is we'll figure out the legality of it later, but let's solve America's problems first. So again, I'm not going to go ahead and say that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is not without faults. He has lots of faults, actually. However, I will say that I pretty much rank him as our number one president for really guiding America through two really crazy, horrible times and doing a pretty good job of it. No president is perfect, but I would definitely put FDR in my top 5, and really, you pretty much got to put FDR as number 1. And let's figure out why over the course of really these next 2 chapters. Now, here's the part that blows my mind. Hoover being this awful president that no one likes, runs for re-election, and 40% of America votes for him. This just proves to me that people vote for the political party that they affiliate with, not for the candidate or not for the issues. People vote down party lines their entire life, not really thinking about what the candidate has or has not done or will not do for America. If there's one thing you get from me guys, I really hope that you guys don't just say, I'm a Republican, I'm going to be a Republican forever, or I'm a Democrat, I'm always going to vote Democrat. Please read the issues and follow, the information and the logic. Don't just vote down party lines your entire life. The fact that 40% of America wants to re-elect Herbert Hoover in 1932 just proves to me how ludicrous and stupid most Americans are. I'm telling you right now, Hoover is one of the worst presidents we have ever had. If you want to argue that point with me and do the research, you are more than welcome to. I'm going to stand steadfastly by that comment though. Hoover is not a good president. And the fact that 40% of America wants to re-elect him, Anyway, the Democrats are going to have a new idea. They're going to have a new idea on how to run this country. Here's what the Democrats are going to argue. Let's get rid of prohibition because that was dumb. So let's get rid of that. Again, in 1932, you still could not drink alcohol. You're going through a Great Depression. You can't even escape by alcohol. What kind of country is this? Don't listen to this with your parents. Anyway, so let's get rid of prohibition. Number 2, let's support farmers with aid programs. So let's actually help these farmers because Americans need to eat, and if farmers don't exist and there aren't any farms around, they're not going to eat. That's going to kind of stink. And let's figure out if we can balance this budget. Like that's ever going to happen. They decide to run with this candidate. He's actually a household name. He is the distant cousin of our boy, Teddy Roosevelt. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I will call FDR for pretty much the rest of this chapter. He's an unlikely candidate. He's rich, he comes from a famous family, and also had a severe bout with polio, which left him crippled. Although most Americans had no idea he had this affliction. And this is something we have to think about. Americans are inherently shallow. Would we elect someone that was in a wheelchair today? Man or woman, would we elect someone in a wheelchair? I don't know if America would today. I think we are too shallow. Now, granted, during this time period, most Americans were unaware of the fact that FDR couldn't walk and was basically wheelchair-ridden almost, his entire presidency. I don't know if we would elect him today, which is unfortunate because, again, I rank him as perhaps our greatest president, and many Americans would overlook him because he was handicapped. Maybe that'll make you guys, think about your own personal prejudices. Anyway, Roosevelt is going to win this in a relative landslide. We would say that he has a popular mandate. He wins this in a relative landslide. Roosevelt promised Americans something. He promised them a new deal for the American public. He didn't really mention what that was going to be just yet, but basically he gave Americans hope. If there is a period of horrible economic panic or collapse, and you promise the American public hope, you're pretty much going to guarantee a victory. So, he promised Americans hope, and he's going to be given the victory. He has 3 major goals here. I call them the 3 R's. Make sure you write them down. He promises America relief, recovery, and reform during this time period. And you guys will have to judge for yourself how successful he may have been on this, but let me give you the details. To achieve these goals, Roosevelt is going to assemble a group of economists, political theorists, and professors that he calls his brain trust. Again, El Presidente is nominated in November, and it takes about 2 months for the president to, become president. So in the meantime, President Roosevelt is going to sit with his brain trust and say, okay, I promised the American public I was going to solve their problems. How on earth do I solve their problems? Help me. And they spend the next 2 months really figuring out a plan to save the American economy. We call this plan the New Deal. Let's go over how this works. Now again, we're going to start going through all these weird specifics, and we're going to go through a lot of acronyms and a lot of hardcore details. So keep up with me. I know it's a lot. It's not easy, but that's the other reason why I'm recording this. I know you guys can handle it. All right, here we go. What happens in America over the next 100 days is going to be a drastic shift in the U.S. economy and a drastic shift in the U.S. government. It's actually kind of interesting that this ends up being 100 days because 100 is kind of a significant period in world history. Napoleon after he was exiled, he came back and he reconquered Europe after 100 days. FDR is going to basically revitalize the entire United States economy and government in 100 days. And really, from here on out, we always look at the first 100 days of any president's presidency as a litmus test to see if they're going to be any good as president. So for the rest of your life, you're going to hear the phrase, what is President blank going to do during the first 100 days of his or her presidency? And now you guys are going to kind of know where that comes from. Because over the next 100 days, FDR is going to drastically change the U.S., and maybe it was for the better. Let's see what he does. In FDR's first inaugural, he says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Which is great, but I'm also afraid of starving to death. So let's see if we can solve that, El Presidente. Anyway, over the next 100 days, FDR is going to send over a dozen bills to Congress, and Congress is going to pass every single one of them. And all of these bills are going to be designed to somehow help the American economy and the American banking system. Now, the Brain Trust basically told FDR that the root of all of these problems and the root of the recovery of America is going to be the banking industry. That's what needs to be fixed first. We'll worry about the stock market later, but we got to figure out the banks first. So, on March 5th, the New Deal is actually going to start with a 5-day weekend. Sweet. What does that mean? Well, FDR is going to shut down the banks. On March 5th, Roosevelt called for 4-day bank holiday, but Sundays. His goal basically was to say, okay, Americans, you need to stop going to banks and taking all your money out, because when you do that, the bank collapses and everyone that didn't get their money out has nothing now. So he basically shuts down every bank in the country and says, nope, no more banking business. We're going to stop. We're going to change how they work. This is actually a pretty smart idea if you ask me. Here's what it's called. The Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933 is basically going to give the federal government the power to inspect all banks. If a bank is solvent, which is a fancy way of saying if the bank has money and is able to operate, it could reopen after 4 days. If the bank was not solvent or not stable, the federal government would take it over. Now, on top of that, the federal government's going to establish something called the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Fund, which insured banks for up to $5,000. So here's how this works. When you guys put money in at Wells Fargo, or whatever bank you use, I use Wells Fargo because it's the easiest, you put, some money in Wells Fargo. Let's just pretend that, the bank is robbed, or an asteroid from space hits that bank and Wells Fargo explodes. Do you still have that money? Well, before 1932, the answer was no. That because the bank is gone and the money burned or the money's not there, you've got nothing. But after the Great Depression, and part of the New Deal is that your money is federally insured. Now, at the time period, it's up to $5,000. I think now it's insured up to $100,000 per account. But the basic premise here is that just because the bank closes, it doesn't mean your money is gone. The federal government says, no, you had money in the bank, we got your back. Which is the way it should have been from the very beginning. But it's not. It blows my mind that it took until the 1930s for the United States to figure this out. Blows my mind. That's 80 years ago when your grandparents were born. It just scares me that this is how the U.S. economy worked. Anyway, on top of that, we're going to establish the Federal Securities Act, which is going to require corporations to provide complete information on all stock offerings. Again, because stocks were overinflated and they were devalued and the market was all crazy, no one knew what a company was really worth anymore. So part of the Federal Securities Act is to say, okay, what are you actually worth? And companies could be held accountable for lying, which, pretty good idea. Next, The Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC as we call it today, not the football conference. We're talking about the economy here. The SEC basically is going to regulate the stock market to prevent people with inside information from manipulating the market again. The SEC to this day is going to basically monitor the stock market and all business exchanges to make sure that everything's on the up and up. That way there isn't any more buying on margin or any more speculation with the stock market. And in fact, with a couple of exceptions, this has actually been a very good thing for the United States economy. You'll see what those exceptions are as we go. Now, look, it's one thing for the president to do all these crazy things, but you know what? The president has to be relatable to the American public. So, FDR would do something that now we kind of think of, not even really think about anymore. We don't think about this being kind of a drastic change. But what FDR would do is he'd get on the radio once a week and he would tell the American public, all right, here's the plan. This is what we're doing. They were called fireside chats. And they're exactly what they sound like. Pretend that you and your family are sitting around, I don't know, the dinner table and having a chat about family finances or family expenses and talking about what you're going to do. Well, that's essentially what a fireside chat was. El Presidente, FDR, would basically talk to the American public in really easy to understand terms and say, all right, guys, here's the plan. The banks are kind of crazy right now, so we're going to shut the banks down and we're going to reopen them if the bank is solvent. Now, here's the cool thing. Whatever money you have in the bank is going to exist no matter what. If the bank is closed for any reason, you still get your money. Isn't that awesome? And he would say it in calm, pleasing tones. He would really calm the Americans' fears. He said all we have to fear is fear itself. And a big part of what he does is he calms America down. He almost kind of sounds like a grandfather while he does it, too. Have to give FDR some credit for this action. And it does a really good job in helping America out. Now, let's get to the more complicated stuff. Let's talk about alphabet soup. Okay, you are now looking at perhaps the most complicated slide and the most concrete details on any slide of the entire year. Now, let me tell you what alphabet soup is, and then I'll go over the specifics. The basic idea is now that the banks are under control, now we have to worry about the other aspects of the New Deal. We have to work on the other aspects and the other problems of the country. We have a little bit of relief that needs to be done. We've already reformed, but we have some relief that needs to be done and some recovery that needs to be done to really make America more successful. So, let's see what FDR does to fix the American economy. Excuse me, nothing worse than having to burp right in the middle of a lecture. Anyway, let's go through them. Number one, the Public Works Administration, or the PWA. This organization gave federal money to states to build schools, roads and bridges, etc. The focus is to build infrastructure. Now, this is going to be a common trend. The U.S. government is going to be building stuff, building schools, building bridges, building roads. Why? Well, it's a really good way to not only give people jobs building stuff, but to also have stuff that we need to have a successful government. You can't have a successful, trade in America if you don't have roads. So, let's have people build roads. That way, if the government funds roads being built, then once those roads are built, it'll make it easier to transport goods on those roads and help businesses. It's not rocket science, but if you know anything about American history, it might as well have been, because many people say this is a stupid thing for the government to spend money on. Blows my mind. Anyway, next, the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is going to be really the workforce for America during this time period. The CCC is going to put young men to work building roads, developing parks, planting trees, and reforesting America. By 1935, over 500,000 young men are going to be involved in this program. So, we need to have this bridge built. We're going to have the CCC do it. We need to have, remember all those national parks that Teddy Roosevelt set up? You know what would be kind of cool? If you could walk through them. Hey, let's have a bunch of people, this is going to sound strange, let's have a bunch of people make hiking paths. Let's have them make bridges and have them make roads. In fact, we have a lot of infrastructure in this country today that was built by the CCC. If you're a nerd like me, next time you guys go on a hike in a national park or in any area, you'll usually see what alphabet soup agency developed that park. There'll be signs that'll say this was built by the CCC or the YCC or stuff like that. And that's actually where a lot of our hiking trails and a lot of our um, other infrastructure stuff comes from that we still have today. But again, you're probably not the kind of person that goes and finds these things. But I am. Anyway, moving on. The CWA, the Civil Works Administration, is going to provide 4 million immediate jobs during the winter of 1933. This group is going to build over 40,000 schools, and this organization also paid for teachers' salaries. That way we can give kids somewhere to be. They also built over 500,000 miles of roads. Again, if you just apply that they're infrastructure projects, you'll be okay. Speaking of infrastructure, let's talk about Tennessee. If you don't know anything about Tennessee, you wouldn't know that Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley, tends to flood a lot. You have all all the rain coming down from the Appalachian Mountains, which is basically going to drain through the Ohio rivers. But what ends up happening is that there's going to be a lot of excess water and flooding in this region. So, the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to build a bunch of dams along the Tennessee River Valley. The idea is if we build these dams, we can have them use hydroelectric power, which would be generated by the dams in order to, one, stop the flooding, and two, provide electricity to this region that so desperately needs it. You could argue that, West Virginia is still pretty far behind the rest of the world, which is actually, the TVA brought them as far ahead as they are now, which is still like 80 years behind us. Anyway, National Recovery Administration. This is going to set prices for all products and is going to demand fair labor standards among industries and promote companies who did not lay off employees. So basically, FDR couldn't necessarily legally mandate every business follow certain rules, but what he could say was, "Hey, Americans, when you go to the grocery store and you're going to buy a product, look for products that have a blue eagle on it. This blue eagle means that this company plays by the rules, and they're going to try to make as many jobs. They're going to have fair prices. They're going to play by the government's rules. They'll have a blue eagle for their symbol. So when you go shopping, those are the companies that are good." Now, can you imagine if Barack Obama came out and said this today? Many Americans would, maybe go and say, okay, this guy's trying to help America. Here's a product he has. If a business agrees with him and they're going to try to help America too, they get to put, I don't know, a picture of a bald eagle flexing on their product. Well, you know what? Maybe you would go and buy all the products that have the bald eagle flexing, which would encourage other companies to also play ball. This is a pretty smart move on FDR's part. In fact, I think it's one of the smartest things he does, and it encourages many American businesses to play with the New Deal that maybe wouldn't have before. Finally, the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This is basically going to pay farmers to destroy their crops. They still want the farmers to farm, but they're going to basically pay the farmers to get rid of the excess. This is going to stabilize the pricing market and also going to stabilize the farms out in the American West. It's going to seem kind of strange that the government is going to basically tell people to stop farming and to destroy crops, but that's what they're going to do because the market is oversaturated right now, and it's going to help stabilize the cost of certain products. By the way, not every single New Deal program is going to be successful. In fact, many of them fail. But that's kind of the whole idea behind what FDR is doing. He's going to try something. Even if they fail, it's okay. We want to try something to help make America better. Now again, this is going to be a huge expansion of the power of the federal government. There's nothing in the Constitution about anything I just said. None of that's in there. But FDR is going to use the elastic clause and say, well, it's part of the government's job to promote the general welfare. What better way to do it than to make sure Americans have jobs? I know it seems kind of, we don't necessarily question that so much in America today, but during this time period, this is going to be a huge change in how the government works. FDR and the New Deal are insanely popular during this time period, but that's not to say that everyone necessarily agrees with what's been going on here. In fact, many Republicans and even a lot of Democrats are going to say, you know what? We don't like the New Deal. Many of them actually formed this group called the American Liberty League, which basically is to protest FDR's actions. Their main goals are the exact opposite of what the New Deal is. The AFL in this case is going to want to promote business and to promote a smaller government. But that's the exact opposite of the New Deal. The New Deal is to support Americans and to have a larger government to help do that. So again, there's going to be some conflict during this time period. Two other people are going to be having conflicts during this time period with FDR. Their names are Father Coughlin and Dr. Francis Townsend. They both have different ideas, though. Father Coughlin is a radio show host with over 40 million listeners, and he basically called FDR a socialist and an anti-Semite. That's him over there on the right. You could tell because he's wearing a collar. That makes him a priest, I'm assuming. Now, on the left, you see this old dude. I mean, he looks old. So he must want something for old people. And in fact, that's going to be an argument he makes. Dr. Francis Townsend, sitting over here on the left, and he's going to advocate some sort of a welfare system for retired Americans. Most of the New Deal programs in Alphabet Soup are going to be for young people to rebuild the country. What happens if you're old and useless and can't move? Are you going to be left behind by the New Deal? Dr. Townsend's going to say that the New Deal is forgotten about the elderly and that something needs to be done for them. It's going to take a couple years, but a program's eventually going to be created called the Social Security Act, which is designed to do just that. I'll explain it when we get to it. Now, despite these challenges to the New Deal, FDR is going to win re-election in a relative landslide in 1936. He's already been president for 4 years, and he's slowly but surely turning around the American economy. And the American public goes, you know what, FDR? We got your back. 4 more years sounds good. So, he wins the election of 1936 in a even easier landslide. Remember when I said that FDR, there's some people that kind of disagree with some stuff FDR did and would challenge someone like Mr. Mullen saying he's perhaps our greatest president, that there's some stuff that he did that's kind of a smash on his legacy? Well, here is one of the big things they say that is wrong with FDR. Now, the Supreme Court is going to have some challenges to the New Deal. They're going to argue its constitutionality. In fact, the Supreme Court's going to say that the New Deal is almost essentially unconstitutional. And they're not wrong. I mean, the Constitution doesn't say anything about really 90% of what FDR does. He's just going to make a bunch of assumptions and figure out the legality of all of it later. Well, it's a little bit later, and the Supreme Court's going to say, look, you really can't do this. In fact, many of the programs that FDR sets out, the Supreme Court is going to challenge almost one by one and say, nope, that is illegal. For example, the NRA is going to be, not the gun one, the other NRA is going to be challenged by the Supreme Court, and it's going to be knocked down. Then the Supreme Court's going to tackle the AAA and knock that one down as well. Again, both of those programs are successful, but they're going to be challenged on their constitutionality. FDR gets a little bit upset here. As FDR continued to drive more legislation through Congress, the Supreme Court continued to tackle and dismantle them, and FDR got tired of dealing with this. So, FDR comes up with a plan to basically add some more people to the Supreme Court that would agree with him. We call this packing the court. Here's his idea. His idea is called the Judicial Reorganization Bill. The basic plan would basically say that the president could appoint a new member to the Supreme Court for all the judges that are over the age of 70, which most of them were because they're old and they never die. The plan was for FDR to be able to appoint 6 more judges, making a total of 15 judges on the Supreme Court. This would make it easier for FDR to win judicial decisions and make it so that way no one could challenge the New Deal. Now, the American public's like, whoa, buddy, you can't just get rid of the checks and balances in the Constitution because somebody disagrees with you. We're not cool with this. And this idea is going to get shot down pretty quick. But again, this is one of the things that FDR says and does that many people challenge and question his leadership during this time period for this reason. That being said, FDR didn't let this little mishap hold him back, and he decides to keep challenging and to keep changing America. It's been about 4 years. The year is now 1936, and it's time for the New Deal to make a second approach. The economy's improved somewhat, and now it's time for the New Deal to shift gears to focus more on the poor. In fact, FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, is going to call for a second New Deal. And FDR is going to have some more goals on what needs to be done in America over his next 4 years as president. In fact, there's 6 of them. Number 1, he wants to expand all of the public works programs he's already put in place. Number 2, he wants to assist the rural poor. Rural? I can never say that word right. Just people aren't in cities. Those poor. Number 3, he wants to support labor. Number 4, he wants to give benefits to retired workers. Number 5, tougher business regulations. And number 6, to help pay for all this, heavier taxes on the rich. He calls these the Second New Deal. Here are some specific. Let's add some more to the whole alphabet soup thing, because why not? We're already not confused. Next, the Works Progress Administration. This is going to give $8 billion in funding for non-traditional things like art and photographs. In fact, some of the pictures that you've seen in today's PowerPoint slide actually come from the WPA. FDR is going to pay, the federal government is going to pay artists to take pictures of America. That way we can have records from this time period. And that's actually how we know how bad a lot of these things were, because we have a lot of art being done. It seems kind of strange to fund the arts, but it's a big part of America, it's a big part of our culture that we did this and continue to do this to this day. Over 8 million people are going to be employed by the WPA, because the WPA is also going to, build bridges and do other stuff like that. But again, basic premise here is the government's going to continue its employment of Americans. Next, the FSA, or Farm Securities Administration. This group is going to provide federal loans to small farmers to buy land. Small farmers, not big farmers. This, coupled with other acts, which is going to basically pay farmers to regrow grass, is going to help stop the growth of the Dust Bowl. Let's regrass America. That way we don't have a big giant dust cloud covering the entire country. Finally, the Wagner Act, or Wagner Act for those of you fans of classical music, or you might know it better as the National Labor Relations Board. This is basically going to give the federal government the power to protect workers. This is necessary because labor unions are not super helpful during this time period, and it basically is going to solidify the fact that the U.S. government should be helping labor and really promote the labor movement. Now, the Social Security Act. One of the largest and most significant parts of the New Deal that still is with us today is this idea called Social Security. Basically, it's a system that establishes an income, it's a system of income taxes, I should say, which is going to establish a public pension fund which people can pay into when they retire. The basic premise is a certain amount of your income is taken away every month and dumped into a big giant federal bucket. And you just put money in there and you can't do anything about it. One day when you retire, though, you can start taking money out of that bucket with interest. The idea being that the Americans would help pay for all of the old people, in that you work your entire life, that way when you're old, you can take money out of this bucket too. This is going to be a great system as it's set up. But eventually, we start to get more and more old people in America, and they're just not dying fast enough, and they're taking out a significant amount of money more than what they put in. But that's going to be a whole different question that you're going to study in your economics and government classes. For this class, just know that a way to address the problems that we have with the older generation is to set up a system where you basically have a publicly funded pension program that pays you to not die after you've already been pretty old. It also serves as a type of unemployment insurance. However, this act is going to set up the idea that the government is responsible for the social welfare and be responsible to basically make sure you stay alive. There's still going to be some arguments about this idea and how effective it really was and if it's a good system for America. But it's still with us today, despite all of its costs. Now, Roosevelt's Second New Deal is going to re-energize, I should say, the Democratic Party. FDR is going to keep old Democrats happy, but he's also going to gain support among city dwellers, mainly because of his programs which give them jobs. We call these people a new Democratic coalition. So FDR is going to make old Democrats happy. He's going to make young Democrats happy. He's going to make Democrats out west happy and Democrats out east happy, and in the north and in the south. The reason why he is so successful is that the Democratic Party really rallies behind him. We call it the New Democratic Coalition. However, that being said, FDR's policies do not really help out many black people in this country. Many programs are actually going to tacitly allow racism, and FDR refuses to back a bill banning lynchings in America. The NAACP even says that FDR does nothing for black people. Kind of sad, but that is the story. After several years of the New Deal, there's going to be another little economic problem in this country. The economy was slowly moving upward during the New Deal, but by about 1937, the economy is going to stumble again. And a big part of that is the huge deficit created by the Social Security Act. So Roosevelt comes up with a new idea that we know and love and still use to this day. It's called deficit spending. The basic idea is we're going to keep spending money regardless of the fact that we don't have any left. We're going to keep spending money, and we're going to have our grandchildren basically pay off the money we're spending now. Now, the idea was hopefully the economy will improve and we won't have to keep doing this, and we'll be able to pay ourselves back immediately. But until then, we have to keep the spending going to keep the economy going. And this is a process we have used pretty much every day in this government since. And now we owe several $trillion back to ourselves. But don't worry, you'll be paying that off the rest of your life. This idea has a strong connection to what we call Keynesian economics. It comes from a guy named John Maynard Keynes. He said that if the government built infrastructure during an economic depression, the economy itself would eventually recover without the government having to raise taxes. That's essentially how deficit spending works. Roosevelt takes this advice and continues to spend more money on infrastructure projects, even though the American economy hasn't greatly improved yet. Let's talk about some gains in the labor movement during this time period. Over 7.7 million people worked in factories during the 1920s, but most of these people were were not unionized, mainly because people like Ford did not allow unions to exist in the Ford Motor Company. The National Industrial Recovery Administration, or NIRA, is going to go a long way in helping out labor. It's going to set maximum work hours, going to determine minimum wages, and determine price ceilings and floors for products. It's also going to set production quotas so no one business can control all the other ones. It also specifically forbade yellow dog contracts. This allowed unions to recruit members again and to get some more power back. This is also going to be coupled with the NLRA, or the National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner Act, which is basically going to help labor. The labor movement is going to drastically improve during the Great Depression. This all leads to something that we call the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is going to call for a universal federal minimum wage of 25 cents an hour and a maximum work week of 44 hours. It also specifically bans all child labor to any child under the age of 16. This is going to be some significant improvements in the United States during this time period that we kind of, take for granted now. Minorities are going to suffer the worst during the Great Depression, and unfortunately, they're also going to be the least represented during this time period. Many blacks could not get jobs and suffered a significantly higher unemployment rate. Blacks were also discriminated against in many New Deal programs. So, for example, the CCC would not allow black people to join, despite the fact that they are the ones that are, need the help the most. They would not allow blacks to join. Eventually, a program called the Fair Employment Practices Committee is developed in order to assist blacks with finding employment, specifically in the defense industry of the United States. There's a famous case that blacks are also going to face a lot of racial discrimination during this time period. There's a famous case about the Scottsboro boys. I'm gonna really not do this justice, but I'm just going to mention it briefly. You could spend a lot of time discussing this case. This is a famous case in the 1930s involving 8 young boys from a place called Scottsboro, Alabama. They were convicted to death, or to a death sentence for a rape that supposedly occurred. However, they were not given a fair trial, they were convicted by an all-white jury, and there was no real evidence against these boys. All 8 boys are going to be tried at the same time rather than individually. Um, Eventually, the Supreme Court's going to step in and say, no, this trial is not legal or not constitutional. But the basic premise here is that during this time period, blacks are going to be unfairly racially discriminated against. That's not to say that Native Americans are going to have some significant problems. It wasn't until 1924 that we actually gave Native Americans full U.S. citizenship. They were always kind of seen as subjects, not citizens of this country, and even had restricted voting rights up until 1924. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 is going to return tribal lands to Native Americans and try to restore their autonomy. It only took until 1934 for us to just say, hey, you know what, that was kind of mean. And really, it's not until the 1990s that we ever actually, apologize. Oops. Hispanics and the American South, or Hispanics in the American Southwest, are also going to face discrimination by arriving whites. The Okies coming from the Midwest, and many Hispanics are going to be deported back into Mexico during this time period, even if they are full American citizens. So, the question we have to ask ourselves is: did this actually work? Does the New Deal actually work? Is it successful? Well, by 1937, the American economy had improved enough to convince most Americans that the Great Depression was over. According to this graph, they were way wrong, because 1938 is going to hit, and that's going to be a rough year. Eventually, FDR is going to be pressured by Congress to stop spending so much money. This is starting to cost a lot of money, and it hasn't really proven too dramatically successful. So, FDR is going to start really reducing the New Deal by 1940. In fact, the New Deal is essentially stopped by 1940. The role of the government is going to drastically expand during this time period, and the government is now going to be actively involved in the economy, in labor disputes, and in the social welfare of its people. The New Deal today would cost about $600 billion if we were to do this exact same program. Maybe even more than $600 billion today. But the basic premise here is that this was a very expensive endeavor by the government, and it was really only marginally successful. Many historians argue that the true success of the New Deal and the real end of the Great Depression is not going to come until World War II. But that's another chapter. I'll leave it up to you guys if you think that the New Deal is actually successful. Successful? Is that how you pronounce that word? Yeah, if it's actually successful after you guys read the next chapter, and read this chapter as well. But I'll leave you with this. Had the United States not have done this, things would have gotten significantly worse. You can see that the economy is going to have a really, really bad by the time the New Deal starts. And the New Deal does slow it down. It does slow down the collapse of the American economy. It does have some programs that are really important. The FDIC is drastically important to the United States today. I'd even argue that the Social Security Act is really important to many of your grandparents. These are all programs that we are, really thankful for having in America today, and it's part of the success of this time period. And with that, this chapter is over.